Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to touch on something that is fairly close to my heart as a creator, as it's one of the first things that I actually worked on when it comes to my contributions to the world and Chronicles of Darkness as a setting. For those who have checked out my 100 Kinfolk project, you know what I'm talking about. For those who haven't, the link will be in the video description below. But this week, I want to talk about what I call Mortals Plus characters, or Lesser Supernaturals, if you choose to think of them that way. And these are characters who fill that role between someone who is truly mortal, just a regular old human going around their lives in the world who has no idea there are supernatural creatures, and the monsters we end up playing, as well as the things that are far more powerful than our player characters. Because often, particularly storytellers, will find themselves scrabbling for something between those two extremes, and forget that there's already one in the game. Now, for folks who may not be familiar with this, or who are new to the setting, there's not a section labeled Mortals Plus in most games. That's just the term that I use, because each game has a different name for them, and they fill a different role in each game. But if you're playing Vampire, these are your ghouls. If you're playing Werewolf the Apocalypse, these are your Kinfolk. If you're playing Changeling the Lost, these are your Ensorcelled Mortals. If you're playing Mage, these are your Familiars. These are characters who, in some way, shape, or form, have at least a limited knowledge of what's going on behind the veil, and they usually have some variety of supernatural power or benefit or something that lets them assist the actual supernatural creatures, and they usually pay for this by performing some role or doing some duty on behalf of the supernatural community. And that can be very useful, both mechanically and story-wise. Now, let's start with mechanics, because that's probably the easiest one to wrap your head around, and it's the one that lots of storytellers really overlook. But let's take a moment and say you want to create a challenge for your characters. Your players are really getting into the meat of your game, and you want to throw something at them that is something that's going to give them pause, that they're going to have to sweat over. But you don't necessarily want to pull out the big guns all the time. You don't necessarily want to have a pack of corrupted werewolves. You don't want to have a great spirit that's going to just lay waste to entire city blocks if they don't stop it. Those are big, arc-ending villains that you're going to have to mess with. But at the same time, you don't want to just have the usual mortal threats. You don't want your players to just be dealing with a gang, the police. I don't know why I said it twice. But you don't just want to throw mortal things at them, where they're not allowed to use any of their supernatural powers for fear of breaking the veil and making themselves known. But you also don't just want to use those big supernatural threats, because if you use those too often, they stop being special. Mortals Plus characters represent that sweet zone, that Goldilocks zone in between the two, because they are more of a threat than truly mortal characters. They're not as much of a threat as actual supernatural monsters, but they, because of the nature of what they are, allow your players to use their abilities without fear of reprisal from breaching the masquerade, breaking the veil. Because Mortals Plus characters are aware of the supernatural world, that means that you're allowed to use your supernatural abilities with them and around them, whether they're allies or antagonists, and that's very important to remember. So if you want to have a scenario where your players are allowed to dig into their special bag of tricks a little bit, where they're allowed to bring out some of their unique abilities, having an antagonist who is a mortal with a little bit extra. Say that you have a private military company made up of ghouls. That means that you have a serious threat on your hands, because you have individuals who are skilled, who are armed, and who are knowledgeable. And they heal faster than they should. They can increase their mortal abilities far more than they should be able to. At the same time, this means that your players don't have to hold back as much. They don't have to worry about ghouls going to the cops and claiming that there's this strange supernatural threat out there, because then they're going to violate that agreement that your players are also operating under this secret world setup that we have. So that's a lot of fun. But at the same time, Mortals Plus characters also represent important story beats that storytellers shouldn't overlook the value of, and that players shouldn't overlook the value of, because as players we can also get allies, contacts, even retainers, and Mortals Plus characters make ideal setups for those because they represent that network of people out in the mortal world who are keeping their eyes open, who act as informants or who act as cat's paws for the supernatural communities at large. And that can do something very important for you that is great for world building, and that's making the supernatural world feel ever present without constantly introducing new, very powerful creatures into it. So it's one of the conceits that can sometimes be difficult to balance, is that while there are powerful supernatural creatures in the world of darkness, they're supposed to be fairly rare. Fairly rare out of 8 billion people is still pretty common, but at the same time it can feel like it stretches credulity, that there's this many vampires, this many werewolves, this many changelings, if you're just constantly introducing new ones. And these Mortals Plus characters fill that gap, because you may only have a handful of truly notable vampires in a city, you may only have a dozen changelings, but amongst those people, how many servants do they have? How many individuals have sworn an oath, blood-bound themselves? How many people serve the interests of a particular mage cabal? And that can really fill out the setting. Not only that, it can add that element of paranoia, because these individuals are often not as obvious as their supernatural counterparts. Unless you are looking for them, and unless you have some variety of ability to determine what they are at a glance, it can be very difficult to realize that they're walking amongst you. And that is another one of the very useful abilities they have. They can often act as spies for their masters and mistresses. They can keep them abreast of what's going on in the world at large, without those supernatural creatures having to go out and put themselves at risk and paint a target on their back. And as such, they can also act as kind of the next step on the ladder when it comes to finding your antagonist, if that's how you're using them. Or if you, as a player character, want to have some of these individuals as servants, as minions, as assistants, they can fill all of those roles for you as well, whether it's making sure that reservations are made, whether it's keeping an eye on your various enemies to be sure that you know where they're moving and what's going on, whether it's just guarding your apartment while you're off doing important supernatural stuff. They can fill a lot of different roles. But there is one other thing you can do with them that I think is very fun, and that might be worth thinking about if you've been looking for a different way to experience the world in Chronicles of Darkness, and it's what I refer to as a Mortals Plus game. And generally speaking, when we're playing in a World of Darkness game, we focus on playing the monsters. We want to be vampires, we want to be werewolves, we want to be mages or changelings or Prometheans or whatever it is. But sometimes, if you want to have a unique challenge and a unique perspective, try taking on the role of one of these lesser supernaturals instead, and see how much more challenging the game gets, and experiencing a very different setup. If you just want to play a vampire game, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. But imagine playing as a bunch of ghouls who are just trying to serve the whims of your various masters and mistresses. Are you competing with each other to try and see who gets embraced? Are you just trying to live your life and do your job? It presents a lot of opportunities that we don't normally have when it comes to power level and power scale when we're playing full-fledged members of the supernatural community. And it can offer a lot of unique challenges if your players, or if you as a storyteller, are up for that kind of game. It's worth thinking about, and it's something that I've enjoyed in the past, so I wanted to mention it at the tail end of this. But, to summarize, these individuals aren't just window dressing, they're not just background for the setting, though you can use them as that if you want. They represent a very useful tool, and like all tools, it's important to remember, especially when those tools are mortal in nature, numbers often win. Because if you need to have one challenge that's very big, if you need to have one challenge that takes an entire team of people to deal with, that challenge is likely going to be one of the very big supernatural threats. But when you have an organization, when you have a group of people that operate as an opposed interest or as an antagonist, you can have a lot more of them, but make them a lot smaller individually. It's the question of, would you rather fight one baboon with a sword, or would you rather fight 1,000 ducks? The 1,000 ducks doesn't sound all that difficult until you really start thinking about it. And in that case, what if those 1,000 ducks also had 1,000 duck-sized swords? Something to think about. But for those who enjoy the idea of really embracing your Mortals Plus characters and using more of them, check our description below. In addition to the 100 Kinfolk project, which should be linked there, I've created various individuals for various different splats. There should be mediums, there should be ensorcelled mortals, and if you want to see more ghouls, which should also be linked there, let me know. Leave a comment down below which splat you'd like to see more of, which setting you feel needs more NPCs like this. And if you've got a fun story about a Mortals Plus character that you either played or had as an NPC in your game, tell us the story. I'm curious to hear about it. But as always, leave a comment if you have a particular section of the game world that you feel I haven't covered yet that belongs on this channel, that deserves its own episode. And until next time, happy gaming, everybody.